You're told to shelter in place. Sirens wail. Phones buzz with alerts. Millions of Americans scramble for cover. The government promises equal protection for all. They promise survival is a right, not a privilege, but that's a lie. Because nuclear war isn't decided by missiles or strategy. It's decided by your bank account. The cold truth. Survival is solvency. And most of us are already bankrupt before the first bomb falls. Think about the scale of that. In 1961, President Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise. He said every American would have access to a fallout shelter. He said the Civil Defense Program would protect 70 million lives. Congress authorized $169 million that year. The public believed salvation was coming. Families waited for their government-issued protection, but they didn't understand the math. $169 million sounds impressive until you divide it by 70 million people. That's $2.40 per life. $2.40 to survive nuclear annihilation. You couldn't buy a restaurant meal for that in 1961. You certainly couldn't buy survival. The shelters Kennedy promised required between $1,000 and $1,500 per family to build properly. That's $10,000 to $15,000 in today's money. Most American families in 1961 earned about $5,800 annually. The government was asking them to spend 3 months of gross income on a hole in the ground. Most couldn't afford it. Most didn't build them. And the government knew they wouldn't. The Civil Defense Office received only $40 million per year. That was 0.1% of the nation's defense budget. Experts calculated it would cost $40 billion to actually protect the population. The government was spending 0.1% of what survival required. This wasn't a shelter program. It was a publicity campaign. By 1963, the illusion was crumbling. Only 15,000 private fallout shelters had been built nationwide. Not 15 million, 15,000. The federal government had identified and marked 300,000 public shelter spaces in basements and subways. But only half were actually stocked with supplies. Only half had working ventilation systems. And even if they worked perfectly, 300,000 spaces couldn't protect 200 million Americans. The math was always impossible. But the government kept selling the fantasy because the reality was unthinkable. Millions would die not from radiation, but from poverty, from an inability to pay for survival. The wealthy understood this immediately. While middle-class families waited for government help, the rich built private fortresses. A high-end fallout shelter in 1962 cost between $3,000 and $5,000. Luxury models with air filtration, multiple rooms, and year-long food supplies ran $10,000 or more. Companies like Survive All and American Shelter Corporation marketed to executives and professionals. They advertised in country club magazines. They promised not just survival, but comfortable survival. Your family could weather nuclear war with carpeted floors, bunk beds, and canned gourmet meals. But only if you could write the check. The inequality was obscene. The poorest Americans, those earning under $3,000 annually, had zero chance of affording shelter. They would die in their homes or in the streets. Middle-class families might scrape together money for a basic basement shelter, but they'd have to choose between protection and college funds, medical bills, mortgage payments. The wealthy never made that choice. They built bunkers the way they bought second cars, casually, Inevitably, the message was clear. In nuclear war, capitalism still functions. Your net worth determines your survival probability, and the market is efficient. The poor die first. By the late 1970s, the government quietly abandoned the shelter program. Bunkers fell into disrepair, stockpiles expired, ventilation systems rusted shut. The signs directing citizens to shelters faded and were removed. Congress stopped funding maintenance. Civil defense became a joke, a relic of Cold War paranoia. But the threat never disappeared. It just became less profitable to address. The economics had always been impossible. A credible nationwide shelter system would cost hundreds of billions. Money that could build highways, fund wars, cut taxes for corporations. Politicians chose everything else, and the population learned the real lesson. You're on your own. Fast forward to 2025. Nuclear tensions are higher than at any time since the Cold War. 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. They spent $91.4 billion on their arsenals last year. That's $11,409,000 per hour. Every hour. But civil defense spending in America remains microscopic. The market for bomb shelters is forecast to grow from $137 million in 2023 to $175 million by 2030. Let that number sink in. The private bunker market, serving maybe 10,000 wealthy families, equals 0.15% of 1 year's nuclear weapons spending. We spend 600 times more on weapons than on protecting people from those weapons. The ledger is clear. Offense is profitable. Defense is not. Meanwhile, the super-rich are building apocalypse insurance. Mark Zuckerberg is constructing a $100 million compound in Hawaii with underground bunkers, independent food systems, and energy generation. Peter Thiel bought property in New Zealand, considered the safest refuge from nuclear war. Billionaires across Silicon Valley are investing in luxury survival complexes. Companies like Rising S and Atlas Survival Shelters sell bunkers ranging from $200,000 to $20 million. These aren't crude concrete holes. They're subterranean mansions with gyms, movie theaters, hydroponic gardens, and shooting ranges. Some have swimming pools. The wealthy aren't preparing to survive. They're preparing to thrive, and the economics make perfect sense from their perspective. If you're worth $10 billion, spending $100 million on survival insurance is 1% of your net worth. That's a rounding error. You spend more on art collections and yachts. But if you earn $50,000 a year, building even a modest $10,000 shelter represents 20% of your annual income. Most Americans couldn't access that capital if they tried. 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 40% couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense. These people cannot afford survival. They will die not from radiation, but from insolvency, from insufficient capital, from the mathematics of inequality. Switzerland offers the only counterexample, the only nation that chose a different path. In 1963, Switzerland passed a law requiring nuclear shelter access for every citizen. Developers building new homes had to include bunkers or pay into a public shelter fund. Over 6 decades, Switzerland spent nearly 12 billion Swiss francs building shelters. That's $13.2 billion. For a population of 8.8 million, that's $1,500 per person. Today, Switzerland has 370,000 bunkers. There are more shelter spaces than citizens. Every single resident is guaranteed protection. The shelters are maintained, inspected, and stocked. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Switzerland immediately renovated neglected bunkers. In 2026, they allocated $276 million for upgrades over 15 years. This is what survival looks like when a nation decides everyone's life has value. But Switzerland is wealthy, stable, and small. The United States has 330 million people. Building equivalent shelter capacity would cost approximately $500 billion. That's the entire defense budget for an entire year. No Congress would approve it. No president would propose it. Because the political calculus is simple. Spending $500 billion on bunkers means cutting other programs, raising taxes, or increasing debt. And bunkers don't vote. Dead citizens don't complain. Survivors remember who protected them. But in nuclear war, there are few survivors. So politicians spend money on visible programs with immediate political returns, roads, tax cuts, military hardware, anything except holes in the ground that might never be used. The private sector fills the gap, but only for those who can pay. A basic underground bunker costs $10,000 to $30,000. Mid-range models with air filtration and supplies run $50,000 to $150,000. Luxury bunkers, the kind selling to tech billionaires, start at $500,000 and exceed $20 million. The market is booming. Atlas Survival Shelters installs custom bunkers worldwide. Rising S Bunkers reports multi-year waiting lists. Vivos Group sells shares in communal luxury bunkers in South Dakota, each accommodating hundreds of wealthy families. The sales pitch is always the same. When civilization collapses, you'll be safe. Your family will survive. Your wealth will preserve you. And it's true. Money does buy survival. It always has. But the inequality is staggering. A family earning $40,000 annually cannot build a bunker. They cannot stockpile a year of food. They cannot afford air filtration systems or radiation detectors. They will shelter in basements with plastic sheeting and duct tape. They will drink tap water and hope it's not contaminated. They will ration canned food and pray rescue arrives before supplies run out. Many will die from thirst before radiation sickness. More will die from starvation before the fallout clears. The wealthiest 1% will be underground, comfortable, supplied, and protected. The other 99% will be exposed, desperate, and expendable. This is the economics of nuclear war. This is the balance sheet of survival. Think about what that means in practice. When the sirens sound, when the alerts flash, your survival probability is determined before you take a single action. If you're in Manhattan and you're wealthy, you have a helicopter to leave the blast zone. You have a bunker in upstate New York or a plane to New Zealand. If you're poor, you have a subway that might collapse and a basement that might flood. If you're in Silicon Valley and you're connected, you know which billionaire bunkers have space and who will let you in. If you're working class, you know which public shelters exist, if you're lucky. Most don't even know that. The knowledge itself is stratified. The wealthy have networks, information, and plans. The poor have instructions on government websites they'll never read. After the blast, the economics become even more brutal. Assume you survive the initial detonation. Assume you find shelter before fallout arrives. Now what? You need water. You need food. You need sanitation. You need communication. The wealthy have stockpiles measured in years. They have water filtration systems, freeze-dried meals, medical supplies, and satellite phones. They have generators and fuel. They can wait months underground if necessary. The poor have what they grabbed in 10 minutes. A few bottles of water, some canned food, maybe a flashlight. They will run out in days. And when they run out, they will have to emerge into a contaminated wasteland to scavenge. Radiation exposure becomes inevitable, not from the bomb, but from desperation, from economic necessity. The long-term costs are even more catastrophic. Assume civilization survives. Assume some form of government persists. Reconstruction will cost trillions. The Marshall Plan spent $13.3 billion rebuilding Western Europe after World War II. That's $150 billion in today's dollars. Nuclear war would cause damage hundreds of times worse. Infrastructure destroyed, supply chains severed, agriculture poisoned, water supplies contaminated. Rebuilding would require decades and tens of trillions of dollars. Who pays for that? The wealthy will have preserved their capital offshore in foreign banks, in assets outside the blast zones. The poor will have nothing. They'll be taxed for generations to pay for reconstruction. They'll labor to rebuild cities they can't afford to live in. The survivors will inherit debt measured in lifetimes, and the wealthy will buy assets at fire sale prices, consolidating control over what remains. History teaches this lesson repeatedly. After every catastrophe, wealth concentrates. After the Black Death, landowners bought estates from desperate families. After World War I, industrialists purchased bankrupt factories. After the 2008 financial crisis, private equity bought foreclosed homes. Disaster is profitable for those with capital. Nuclear war would be the ultimate wealth transfer. The billionaires in their bunkers would emerge into a world where competition has been eliminated, where labor is desperate and cheap, where assets are plentiful and undervalued. They would rebuild on their terms, and the survivors would have no leverage to resist. This is why they build bunkers, not just to survive, but to dominate what comes after. The governments know this. They know civil defense is economically and politically impossible. They know most citizens will die, so they focus resources on ensuring government continuity, on protecting leaders, military command, and essential infrastructure. Raven Rock, Mount Weather, Cheyenne Mountain. These bunkers exist. They're maintained. They're staffed. They cost billions, but they protect hundreds, not millions. The message is explicit. The state will survive. The people are expendable. Sovereignty does not depend on citizens. It depends on institutions, on the ability to project power and maintain control. Individual lives are line items in a spreadsheet, acceptable losses. The final insult is this: you paid for your own exclusion. Your tax dollars built the weapons that threaten you. Your labor generated the wealth that billionaires use to build private bunkers. Your work maintains the government facilities that will protect leaders while you die. The system extracted your productivity and gave you nothing in return. No shelter, no stockpiles, no protection, only instructions. Stay inside, sealed doors. Wait for help, help that will never come because it was never funded. This is the ledger of nuclear war, and it balances perfectly. The rich survive, the poor perish. Capital preserves itself. 2026, and the world stands closer to nuclear war than at any moment since the Cold War ended. Russia and NATO clash over Ukraine. China and the United States confront each other over Taiwan. North Korea tests missiles. Iran enriches uranium. India and Pakistan maintain arsenals pointed at each other. 9 nations possess approximately 12,000 nuclear warheads. 2,000 are on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. The probability of use, whether intentional or accidental, increases yearly, and most of humanity remains completely unprepared. Not because preparation is impossible, but because it's unprofitable. If nuclear war begins tomorrow, survival will correlate almost perfectly with wealth. The top 1% will shelter in luxury bunkers. The next 9% might have basic shelters or access to quality public facilities. The remaining 90% will die or suffer catastrophic radiation exposure. This isn't speculation. This is mathematics. This is the ledger, and the ledger never lies. In nuclear war, as in everything else, money talks. Wealth survives, poverty dies. The balance sheet determines who sees the next sunrise and who becomes ash and fallout. And we've known this for 60 years. The question isn't whether you'll survive nuclear war. The question is whether you can afford to. For most of us, the answer was written decades ago in budget meetings and appropriations committees. It was written in the decision to spend billions on weapons and pennies on people. It was written in the mathematics of inequality, in the cold logic of capital preservation. Survival is not a right. It's a commodity. And like all commodities, it has a price. Most of us cannot pay it. So when the sirens sound and the alerts flash, remember this. You were abandoned long before the missiles launched. You were liquidated in a ledger years ago. And the wealthy are already underground, counting the days until they inherit whatever remains. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand the economic forces that actually shape history, the ledgers and balance sheets that determine which nations rise, which fall, and which citizens live or die. Most people don't know this history. Now you do. And that knowledge is the only wealth that might matter when everything else turns to ash.